Let's move on to consider the essay The Shutters Come Down on the Death of Kevin Carter by David Levi-Strauss. So this essay is about the photographer who made an image that we'll consider in just a minute. I want to look at the essay first and then the photograph in particular. Um, the author begins with a very moving paragraph. He says, when it comes to political violence, we want witnesses and demand sacrifice, and sometimes the two come together. Every day, professional witnesses get into position to show us what's happening far away and out of sight. We want to see the broken bodies and sorrowful faces of those who do not have our privileges or protections. He continues, why? Because we feel responsible for them and we like feeling responsible for them. Their suffering gives a context for our comforts and a distant focus for our empathy. The general nature of this article, the general direction of it, is to say that the anger, guilt, and judgment that surround conflict photography need to be considered from the point of view of our role as viewers. So he's starting with the big picture of the role of the viewer, and he says that we want witnesses and we demand sacrifice. Then he turns his attention to this photographer, Kevin Carter, and he spends some time telling us about exactly how Kevin Carter came up in apartheid South Africa and the horrific experiences and conflict and violence and gruesome deaths that he experienced firsthand at great personal danger, and how they traumatized him personally. Kevin Carter professionally delivered on what people wanted. He brought people what they wanted to see, and he experienced personal trauma in the process. Now, it's not made clear in our textbook when they write about this photograph that after Kevin Carter published this photograph, the photograph of the young girl in the vulture, that photograph created a lot of controversy. It led to a lot of controversy in the pages of the New York Times in particular. It was published worldwide, but it was in the New York Times that this big debate raged about whether it was ethical to look at this photograph. The photograph ultimately gained a Pulitzer Prize, but Kevin Carter personally did not experience any gains from that photograph or from that attention. He personally died by suicide very shortly after winning the Pulitzer Prize. And that's the context for this article. That's what the author is telling us about here. This is a photographer who suffered personally, and it wasn't just about this one photograph. It was the whole life leading up to that photograph. But the suffering of the photographer and all of the suffering that we as viewers want to get from that photographer, that we're putting that photographer in the job of handing us. That's what David Levi-Strauss wants us to think about. He says blaming the photographer who makes these images is like blaming a soldier for what's going on in a war. The conclusion of the essay is just really beautifully written. He says that we viewers, we put him there. We put him in front of that starving child and then accused him of moral detachment for making the image that we wanted him to make. Where is our moral engagement in this? Where is our complicity? And where is our forgiveness? And this is the photograph. So this photograph is typically referred to by the title "Struggling Girl, Sudan, 1993." Kevin Carter gave plenty of interviews to give context for the photograph, and explains that when he took this photograph, he had guns pointed at him the whole time by guards who were trying to control the flow of people towards a charity distribution of food. But we don't see any of that in this photograph. Kevin Carter was there as a journalist to observe. His role was to take pictures. His role, and it's the job of a journalist to be neutral observers. We professionally expect that of journalists. So the fact that he is not intervening to help this little girl, to do something to help her, number one, is his job. It's the job of journalists to not intervene. And if we didn't expect that of photojournalists, they wouldn't be able to be there in the middle of conflict. They wouldn't be trusted to be able to be there in positions of conflict. It's their job to not intervene. And with all of that said, there's not anything that he could have done that would have changed the outcome of this photograph in the first place. And he was attempting to show us the situation of famine. He didn't make that vulture land there. In the photograph, we also get the impression that the vulture is a lot closer than it would have been in real life too, because he's using a pretty long lens. Okay, he's some distance away from the little girl and from the vulture, which sort of puts them at a nearer distance from one another than they were in real life. But but when we viewers see this photograph, we see a little child who is naked, starving, alone in the photograph, and incredibly vulnerable. And then we see this vulture that is just so easy to see as a symbol, as a sort of a symbol of death, of violence, of a horrific fate. So it's natural for people to respond to this photograph by saying, why wouldn't the photographer do something? Well, there are a lot of reasons that the photographer couldn't do something, and that's what David Levi-Strauss wants us to think about here in terms of the bigger picture of what we expect a journalist to do. It so happens that Alfredo Jaar, who has made these really challenging conceptual installations about photography, made one about this specific photograph, and it's called The Sound of Silence, and it consists of this sort of small booth that has a projected image of this photograph. It's part of this sort of film that's projected inside of this little booth. When we're in there, we read this narration from Kevin Carter talking about what happened when he took this picture, and then you see the image really briefly. It's a sort of a tribute to what Kevin Carter contributed to the world by bringing this image out in front of people. But Alfredo Jaar's work as a whole is about the inadequacy of photography and about what we expect from photographs and photography's real inability to deliver what we want from it. This is the collection of photographs by Alfredo Jaar that's presented as an installation that's documented in our textbook. This installation is called Real Pictures, and it consists of a whole series of photographs that Alfredo Jaar did make himself on site in Rwanda, and these photographs are not visible to us. They are inside of boxes. So in the installation, each box includes a photograph, which we don't get to see, and the caption that describes what the photograph shows. The description is pretty graphic and clear, but we never get to see what we expected to see. So it's sort of refusing to satisfy this urge, this curiosity. And in the process, it's pointing towards what Alfredo Jaar sees as the failures of the medium. David Levi-Strauss, the same author who wrote our article for today, wrote about this exhibition. He says, in Real Pictures, the tables are turned. Images are buried in order that history might again be made visible and legible. And he continues, it's meant to bear witness to the impossibility of presenting the unpresentable. So it's really about the medium of photography and how we use it and what it's not capable of doing. In other installations, Alfredo Jaar uses photography, but in a slightly different way. In this one, for example, he's got these sort of close-up images of this woman that he encountered in Rwanda. In the installation, the photograph of the woman's eyes scrolls back and forth between that image and this description that explains who she is and what she has seen. He takes a similar strategy with this installation, The Silence of Nduwe Yesu from 1997. Also, a photograph taken in Rwanda. There's one photograph that is reproduced 1 million times. There are 1 million photographs on this enormous, enormous light table. At the time, the way that photographs were processed when people were making a magazine or a book, you would spread slides out on a light table to look at the slides and figure out which ones you wanted to put into your layout. So he's inviting us to come up there and just like handle all of these slides. And people were allowed to do that. So in this installation, The Silence of Medusa, every person who sees the exhibition is invited to handle these slides, to pick them up and look at them. And it's the same picture over and over again, just the eyes of this little boy who saw this horrible thing. In an interview, Alfredo Jaar said, Nduwayesu actually saw his mother and father killed with machetes. His reaction was to remain silent for approximately 4 weeks. He couldn't speak. His eyes were the saddest eyes I had ever seen. I wanted to represent that and speak about his silence. Sometimes silence or a black screen or a pause is used strategically in the media to separate one image as different and possibly more upsetting in its impact, or something that you might want to take a minute to consider before you actually look at it. So that's part of how graphic images are sometimes distributed out in the news media today on websites and such.